Mr. Secretary General, distinguished colleagues, it is symbolic that we are holding today's meeting on the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace, which has been enshrined on the calendar of significant dates under General Assembly resolution dating 12 December 2018. In 2 weeks, we will commemorate the 78th anniversary of the victory during the Second World War, the defeat of Nazi Germany, where my country, with support of allies, made a decisive contribution, set the foundation for the post-war international order. Its legal foundation became the Charter of the United Nations, and our organization, the embodiment of genuine multilateralism, gained a central coordinating role in international politics. In the 80 years of its existence, the United Nations has delivered on the key mission which was entrusted to it by the Founding Fathers. For several decades, the core mutual understanding of the five permanent members of the Security Council on the supremacy of the goals and principles of the Charter guaranteed global security and thereby created conditions for genuine multilateral cooperation governed by universally recognized norms of international law. Now, the United Nations-centered system is enduring a profound crisis. The root cause was the desire of some members of our organization to replace international law and the United Nations Charter with a certain rules-based order. Nobody has seen these rules. They were not the subject of transparent international negotiations. They are devised, crafted, and applied with the goal of countering the natural process of the establishment of new independent development centers, which are the objective manifestation of multilateralism. There are attempts to deter them with illegitimate unilateral measures. These include barring access to modern technologies and financial services. They include expulsion from supply chains, confiscation of property, destruction of critical infrastructure of competitors, and manipulation with universally agreed upon norms and procedures. As a result, global trade has become fragmented, market mechanisms have collapsed, the World Trade Organization has become paralyzed, and now, clearly and openly, the International Monetary Fund has morphed into a tool for the achievement of the goals of the United States and their allies, including goals of a military nature. In a desperate attempt to assert their domination by punishing their insubordinates, the United States has taken the path of destroying globalization, which for many years they have raised up as the highest benefit of all of humanity, advancing the multilateral system, global economic system. Washington and its Western subordinates leverage those rules every time they need to justify illegitimate attempts against those who base their policies in line with international law and those who abandon the parochial interest of the global billion. The Western colleagues have long found it inconvenient to reach agreement through universal formats such as the United Nations for ideological justified policy to undermine multilateralism in abandonment of democracy and countering autocracy. Beyond the Summit for Democracy, where self-proclaimed hegemon determines composition, there are other clubs of select individuals are adopted. The Summit for Democracy, the Alliance for Multilateralism, the Global Partnership for Artificial Intellect, the Global Coalition for Freedom of Media, the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. All of these and other exclusive projects have been devised to undermine negotiations on relevant themes under the aegis of the United Nations, to impose non-consensual concepts and decisions that are convenient for the West, and these are proposed as a position of the international community. Let's call a spade a spade. Nobody allowed the Western minority to speak on behalf of all of humankind. There's a need to be polite and to respect all members of the international community. By imposing the rules-based order, its sponsors arrogantly reject a key principle of the Charter of the United Nations, namely sovereign equality of states. The quintessential nature of the complex of superiority or exceptionalism was the lordly statement of the head of the European Union head, Joseph Borrell, stating that Europe is a heavenly garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I would also quote the joint declaration of NATO-EU dating 10 January 2023, which states, I quote, "The United West will leverage all economic, financial, political, and, I would note this in particular, military instruments at the disposal of NATO and the EU for the advancement of the interests of our common billion." That is what the declaration states. The collective West has arrogantly reshaped for tailored processes of multilateralism at the regional level for the advancement of their interests. Just recently, the United States called for the Monroe Doctrine to be revived, demanding that Latin American countries limit ties with the Russian Federation and People's Republic of China. This policy, however, came up against the decisive focus of countries in the region to strengthen their own multilateral structures, first and foremost, SELEC, and to uphold their legitimate right to stand as a pillar of the multilateral world order. The Russian Federation fully supports these justified aspirations. Now, there have been significant forces in the United States and allies to undermine multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. And this cooperation around economy and security has for decades been unfolding around ASEAN. This system allowed for consensual approaches to be established, which were beneficial to the 10 members, the dozen members of ASEAN and their partners in dialogue, including Russia, China, the U.S., India, Japan, Australia, Republic of Korea, which provided for genuine inclusive multilateralism. By advancing the Indo-Pacific strategy, Washington has embraced a policy of destroying this established architecture. And during the last NATO summit in Madrid, there was an assertion of all peace lovers and about the exclusively peaceful nature of their military programs, announcing global responsibility and divisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the so-called Indo-Pacific region. So now, the policy of NATO, as of course a defensive organization, is now moved to western shores of the Pacific Ocean. The bloc-based approaches undermine the Asia-centric mindsets, and they are manifest in the creation of a military alliance, AUKUS, which has now embraced Tokyo, Seoul, and a number of ASEAN countries. Under the aegis of the U.S., mechanisms for intervention in maritime security issues have been established to uphold the unilateral interests of the West. Mr. Borrell, who I mentioned, promised yesterday to send EU military naval forces to that region. It is not concealed that the goal of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to deter China and to isolate Russia, and this is how Western colleagues view effective multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. After the collapse of the Warsaw Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union departing from the stage, a hope was fermented for the advancement of the principles of genuine inclusive multilateralism in the Euro-Atlantic space. But instead of tapping into the potential of the OSCE on equitable, collective basis, Western countries not only preserve NATO, but contrary to their pledges, they moved towards arrogantly absorbing spaces, including those territories where vital interests of the Russian Federation existed and will always continue to exist. As was reported by the then U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker to President George Bush the Elder, the main threat for NATO is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I would add that presently the United Nations and what is enshrined in its charter also represent a threat to Washington's global ambitions. Russia has painstakingly attempted to reach mutually beneficial multilateral agreements with an emphasis on the principle of indivisibility of security, which was proclaimed and enshrined in outcome documents of the OSCE summits of both 1999 and 2010. There, it states explicitly, categorically, black and white, that nobody is to strengthen one's own security at the expense of the security of others. And no state, group of states, or organization can be vested with a primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace in the OSCE region, or consider any region of the OSCE whatsoever as a part of its sphere of influence. NATO trampled upon these obligations, and the presidents and premiers of its member states, and did the opposite, proclaiming its right to any arbitrary action. An egregious example is the unlawful bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, including with depleted uranium being used, which resulted in an uptick in cancer cases, both for Serb citizens and NATO military personnel. Joe Biden was then a senator, and he, not without pride, he said before the cameras that he personally called for the bombing of Belgrade and the destruction of all bridges on the Dnieper River. And now, the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, Mr. Hill, through media outlets, has called on the Serbs to turn the page and to stop getting upset. About stopping getting upset, the U.S. has gained a great deal of experience. Japan has been shamefully quiet about who bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we know, during the G7 summit, Mr. Blinken, with great pathos, lamented the suffering of victims of the bombing, but he did not manage to mention the culpability of the United States. These are the rules. And after the Second World War, these are criminal misadventures of Washington which were set into play. The shameful invasion by the U.S.-led coalition into Iraq in 2003 was an egregious violation of the United Nations Charter, as was the aggression against Libya in 2011. The result was the destruction of statehood, hundreds of thousands of dead, rampant terrorism. A blatant violation of the UN Charter also was a U.S. intervention in post-Soviet states' affairs. Color revolutions were organized in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. There was a brutal coup in Kiev in 2014, and this also includes attempts to forcibly seize power in Belarus in 2020. The Anglo-Saxons, the West, not only justify or attempt to justify these criminal misadventures, but they also taunt their policy of advancement of democracy, and the same has to do with the rules. Kosovo, they'll recognize independence without the referendum. The Crimea, they won't recognize it despite the fact that there was a referendum. Falklands and Malvinas, they will not be touched, for there was the cleverly referendum there. This is laughable. In order to abandon double standards, we call for all to adhere to consensual agreements which were agreed upon through the 1970 UN Declaration on the Principles of International Law. It explicitly proclaims the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states who, I quote, respect the principle of equality and self-determination of peoples, and which have governments which represent all the people residing on that territory. Any objective observer can clearly see that the Nazi Kiev regime can in no way be regarded as a representative, as representing the residents of the territory who refused to accept the results of the brutal coup in February 2014. And as a result of this, the putschists unleashed war against them similarly. Pristina cannot claim to represent the interests of Kosovar Serbs, who were promised autonomy by the European Union, just like Berlin and Paris promised special status for Donbass. The results of these promises are well known. Our Secretary General stated this eloquently during the Second Summit for Democracy on 29 March. And I quote, "Democracy emanates from the Charter of the United Nations," and its first words, "We the peoples," reflects the fundamental source of legitimate power, the consent of the governed. The consent, I emphasize this. In order to halt the war that was unleashed in the east of Ukraine, multilateral efforts were undertaken for the advancement of a peaceful settlement. These were enshrined in Security Council resolution, which unanimously approved the Minsk agreements. These Minsk agreements were trampled upon by Kiev and its Western handlers, who themselves recently, cynically, and even with pride, recognized that they never intended to implement this. They simply wanted to gain time to funnel weapons into Ukraine against Russia. In this way, there was a public proclamation of a violation of multilateralism, a multilateral obligation of all members of the United Nations, which is enshrined in the Charter, which requires that all members comply with the resolutions of the Security Council. Our subsequent action to prevent confrontation, including President Putin's proposal dating December 2021 for the agreement to be reached on multilateral mutual security guarantees, were high-handedly rejected. Nobody, we were told, can prevent NATO from embracing Ukraine. For all of the years after the coup, despite our insistence, none of Kiev's handlers brought Poroshenko or Zelensky or the Ukrainian Upper Rada to their senses. Nobody brought them to their senses. In the Upper Ukrainian Rada, through legislation, the Russian language, Russian education, Russian media outlets, and Russian culture, religious traditions were destroyed in a direct violation of the Ukrainian Constitution and the Universal Convention on the Rights of National Minorities. In parallel, the Kiev regime, through legislation and day-to-day life, introduced Nazi practice and theory without any concealment. Openly, they organized in the center of Kiev and other cities exuberant torch-bearing marches with SS division banners upheld. The West remained silent, and this was fully in line with U.S. plans to leverage the openly racist regime in the hope of weakening the Russian Federation in a strategic focus on eliminating competitors. It is clear to all, even though not everybody talks about this, it's not at all about Ukraine. It's about how international relations will continue to be shaped through the establishment of a sound consensus on the basis of balance of interests, or through aggressive and volatile advancement of Washington's hegemony. We cannot consider the Ukrainian issue separately from the geopolitical context. Multilateralism provides for respect for the United Nations Charter and all of its interlinkage of its principles, and this was mentioned above. The Russian Federation has clearly announced the goals which we are pursuing through the special military operation to eradicate the threats to our security, which were created for years by NATO representatives directly on our borders, and to protect people who have been deprived of the rights proclaimed through multilateral conventions, to protect them from the public statements of a Kiev regime and their actions and direct threats to destroy and expel them from territories where their predecessors lived for centuries. What were the U.S. doing in NATO doing in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya? Were there threats there to their security, their culture, their religions, their languages? What were the multilateral norms that they guided them in their proclamations of the independence of Kosovo and the violation of the principles of the OSCE, to the destruction of the stable economically stable states of Iraq and Libya, which collapsed as a result of their actions, and there was places were located at thousands of miles from U.S. shores. The multilateral system was a blatant attempt of the U.S., and there's a clear imbalance in the UN Secretariat and the UN as a whole, and this is now seen in the staff who are now taking liberties with politically motivated conduct that is not befitting of international civil servants. We urge the Secretary General to ensure that all of his staff comply with impartiality in line with Article 100 of the UN Charter. We also urge the Secretariat leadership in drafting documents on the common agenda, which was mentioned here, the new agenda for peace, which is mentioned here, to be guided by the need to suggest to member states ways to find a balance of interests rather than helping to advance neoliberal concepts. Otherwise, instead of a multilateral agenda, there will be a deepening of a division between the golden billion and the international majority. Speaking of multilateralism, we cannot be limited to the international context as a whole. Just when we talk about democracy, the international context cannot be disregarded. Double standards need to be abandoned, and multilateralism and democracy need to be respected within states and in their relations one another. Everybody knows that the West, in imposing their understanding of democracy on others, does not want to see democratization of international relations on the basis of respect for sovereign equality of states. But now, advancing their rules on the international arena, they're increasingly asphyxiating multilateralism and democracy at home, applying increasingly repressive tools for suppressing any dissent, as their criminal Kyiv regime has done with the support of its teachers, the U.S. and allies. Distinguished colleagues, as was the case in the Cold War, we have reached a dangerous, possibly even more dangerous threshold. The situation is worsened with the loss of trust in multilateralism, when the financial economic aggression of the West is destroying the benefits of globalization, when the United States and its allies are abandoning diplomacy and demanding clarification of relations on the battlefield. And this is all done in the halls of the United Nations, which was created to prevent the horrors of war. The voices of wisdom are undermined, and they're calling for the revival of culture of dialogue, and they are muzzled by those who have decided to undermine the core principles of multilateral relations. We all need to return to the source, respect for the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and all the diversity and interlinkages. Genuine multilateralism on the international stage at present necessitates adaptation of the United Nations to reflect the trends of the establishment of multilateral architecture of international relations. There's a need to expedite reform of the Security Council to enhance representation of Asian, African, Latin American countries. The current excessive, overwhelming representation of the West in this body undermines the principle of multilateralism. As well as initiative, the Group of Friends in Protection of the UN Charter was established. We urge all states respecting the Charter to join this. There's an important need for to tap in the potential of BRICS, SCO, Eurosec, CISC, STO, and of course, we are in favor of actively leveraging the initiative and position of regional associations of countries of the Global South. An important role in supporting multilateralism can be played by the G20 if Western participants stop diverting the attention of colleagues from pressing matters on its agenda in their attempt to conceal their own culpability for the accumulation of crises in the global economy. Our common obligation is to preserve the United Nations as the tried and tested beacon for multilateralism and coordination of international policies and politics. The key to success is concerted efforts, abandonment of claims for any exceptionalism, and I repeat this once again, respect for sovereign equality of states. This is what we all signed on to when we ratified the Charter of the United Nations. In 2021, President Putin proposed the establishment of a summit. The summit to convene for permanent members of the Security Council. The leaders of China and France supported this initiative. However, unfortunately, this was not realized. This is directly related to multilateralism, not because the 5 permanent members have certain privileges as compared to the others, but specifically due to their particular responsibility under the Charter of the United Nations for the maintenance of international peace and security. And this is specifically what is required now under the imperatives of the UN-centric system, which as a result of the actions of the West is evaporating before very eyes. Concerns about the situation are increasingly prevalent in the multilateral initiatives and ideas of global South countries, from the East and from East, Southeast Asia, from the Arab Muslim world as a general, and Africa, Latin America. We value their intention to focus on concerted efforts for the maintenance of a balance of interest on the basis of the sovereign equality of states and indivisibility of security. And to conclude, I wish to turn to all journalists who are now covering today's meeting. Your colleagues from Russian media outlets were not allowed access here. The United States embassy in Moscow mockingly announced willingness to issue visas when our plane took off. So I insist that you compensate for the loss of the presence of Russian journalists. Try to make your reporting objective so that the international community has a genuinely multilateral objective overview in your assessments and the facts provided. I now return to my duties as the President of the Security Council, and I give the floor to Mr. Khalifa Shaheen Al-Marar, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.